Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this commemorative event organized by the Canadian Network to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. We are a group of 17 Canadian NGOs that cooperate with many others around the world to advance our shared goal, our shared vision, a world free of nuclear weapons. My name is Earl Turcott. I'm the current chair of the CNANW. Now, as most of you know, there are currently 13,400 nuclear weapons in the world today. All of them are many times more powerful than the atomic weapons that obliterated Hiroshima and Nagasaki 75 years ago. Some of them are literally thousands of times more powerful. Now, scientists have determined that an exchange of even 1% of the global nuclear arsenal would kill millions of people immediately and plunge the planet into a nuclear winter that could lead to mass starvation, which combined with the residual effects of radiation could kill billions more. Yet, we find ourselves in the midst of a new nuclear arms race, with all 9 countries in possession of these weapons modernizing and expanding their arsenals. They're also developing new types of nuclear weapons, missile and cyber technologies, and policies that dramatically increase the risk of deliberate use by a state or a non-state actor, or of a nuclear event resulting from miscalculation or accident. And all of this is happening when the international multilateral architecture is under attack by some, and when the treaty regime that has offered some restraint in years past is deteriorating. In the past 3 years alone, we have seen US withdrawal from the nuclear agreement with Iran, US and subsequent Russian withdrawal from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, announced US withdrawal from the Open Skies Treaty, US refusal to renew the New START Treaty that is set to expire early in the new year, a treaty that limits the number of strategic weapons that the US and Russia can deploy. We also witnessed all 9 nuclear-armed states and umbrella states, including Canada, boycott negotiation of the historic Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in 2017. Ladies and gentlemen, we live in perilous times. In January of this year, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists set the hands of the doomsday clock at 100 seconds to midnight, the closest they have been since the clock's creation in 1947. So, we come together today, first and foremost, to pay solemn tribute and to honor the victims and the survivors of the 2 singular, most horrific acts of violence ever perpetrated in human history: the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the United States of America 75 years ago, using atomic weapons developed with the support and active collaboration of the United Kingdom and of Canada. Second, we are here to assess where the world is today with respect to nuclear weapons and how we can best achieve complete and total nuclear disarmament. In the words of CNANW's founding chair, the Honourable Douglas Roche, who we're delighted is with us today, to get rid of them before they get rid of us. We're also marking the 75th anniversary of the founding of the United Nations, a wonderful, ongoing experiment in global cooperation, whose very first resolution 75 years ago sought the elimination of atomic weapons. It is also the 50th anniversary of the entry into force of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, the NPT, a treaty to which almost every nation on Earth is party and that contains a legal obligation, now 50 years old, on all parties to pursue nuclear disarmament. We are very fortunate to have with us as our featured speakers some of the most committed and effective advocates for nuclear disarmament in the world today. Ms. Setsuko Thurlow, the Honourable Douglas Roche, Mr. Alain Dondonnet, Ms. Peggy Mason, Ms. Ray Atchison, Mr. Cesar Yaramil, and Professor Michel Duguay. I will introduce each of our distinguished guests more substantively as we proceed. Now, as several of our speakers, and I am sure many of you have multiple events today, we will unfortunately have to forego our planned discussion period. However, CNANW will organize a fully interactive session in the very near future. We will end our event today with a ceremonial ringing of a bell 75 times to mark each year since the bombings, each year that the world has faced the risk of nuclear annihilation. Our first speaker is a remarkable woman who, as a 13-year-old girl, miraculously survived the bombing of Hiroshima. Ms. Setsuko Thurlow has since dedicated much of her life to advocacy for nuclear disarmament. She has received many awards over the years, including the Order of Canada, commendations from the government of Japan, and along with Ms. Beatrice Fihn, director of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, co-accepted the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize awarded to ICAN for its work advocating for and advancing negotiation of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, a treaty whose text has been endorsed by 122 nations and will enter into force once 50 nations have ratified, which should be in the next year or so, and we'll hear more about that today. Setsuko, it's an honor to have you with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Good to be here. Thank you so much. This is a serious, somber day to remember all those perished. Yes, every day I get calls and emails from people around the world, and just to let me know they're thinking of me. And my thoughts has been very much with the perished. But this morning, I am very cheerful, very happy. Something special happened this morning, and I can hardly wait to break that news to you. But I'll keep it for a while. First, I would say a bit about what it was like to live on August 6, 1945. As explained, I was a 13-year-old junior high school student, and Japan was losing badly at that time. We students were mobilized by the army to do certain things, like go to the army plant and to look after the soldiers' clothes or munitions, or we get sent to the farms to help the farmers. But on that particular day, August 6th, I was at the army headquarters near the station in Hiroshima City. About 30 girls were selected, and we were trained about decoding secret messages. Can you imagine 13-year-old girl doing that kind of top secret things? Anyway, I was a leader of that group, and we marched to the army headquarters. We were on the second floor of the wooden building, which was 1 mile away, or 1.8 kilometers from the hypocenter, ground zero. And we are having the morning assembly. Major and I said, well, you girls, you got the sufficient training. Today you prove you're a full-fledged volunteer for the emperor. And you demonstrate your patriotism. We say, yes, sir, we will. And at that moment, I saw the bluish-white flash in the window. And I remember flying up in somewhere, and I was floating in the air. And that's the end of my consciousness. When I regained the consciousness, I found myself pinned under the collapsed building in the total darkness and total silence. So I knew I was facing death. I started hearing my classmates in the dark. God help me, Mother help me. So I knew I was not alone. Then all of a sudden, very strong hand started shaking my left shoulder from behind with the strong male voice, don't give up, keep moving, keep kicking. I'm trying to free you. You saw the ray coming through that opening, crawl toward it quickly. So that's what I did. And I managed to come out. But by that time, the building was on fire. Anyway, so then 2 other girls came out and 3 of us together. But it happened in the morning. But when we came out, it was dark, like twilight, perhaps because of the certain particles and all the things in the air going up in the mushroom cloud. The soldier said, you girls escape to the hillside. There is a space you can rest. As the eyes got used to, I started seeing the black object coming close to me. I tried to figure out what they are. Where that happened to be the procession of ghostly figure. I say ghostly figure because they simply did not look like human beings. They were just bleeding, burned, blackened, and swollen. And eyes popped out. They are carrying their eyeballs in their hands. Hair was just raised, rising up to the sky. Skin and the flesh were hanging. And as they collapsed onto the ground, their stomach burst open, the intestines stretched out. Well, the eerie thing about that memory was that the place was so quiet. Nobody was talking loud and scream, help me, I need water. No. All we heard was a fainting voice. Water, please. Practically everybody was begging water. They just didn't have the physical, psychological strength left and to be strong in that way. I'm in trouble, come and help me. So we followed the crowd and escaped to the nearby hill. And what we did was, since we did not have the bucket cups to carry the water, and we are not so badly injured, so we washed our body and took off the blood. We tore off the gloves and soaked them in the water. And then we dashed back and put the wet cloth over the mouths of the eye, and they just sucked in the moisture. That was the only kind of so-called help, because I looked around, but anyway, at the foot of the hill, there were huge military training ground, about 2 football fields. So you can imagine, quite huge place. The place was packed with dead bodies and seriously injured. And 3 girls all day kept busy trying to save few people. It was a pretty sad situation. That night we sat on the hill and watched all night the entire city burn. That was my day of that day. As I said, I was rescued. And the total of about 140,000 people killed in an indiscriminate attack. And at that time, population of Hiroshima was mostly women, children, elderly, because able men, even in middle age, they were recruited and they were shipped to the front line. So it was carefully prepared, indiscriminate attack. Now, you and I quoted 140,000, but that's at the end of 1945. Since then, about 100,000 people have died up to this day because of the effect of radiation. Well, I survived in that situation, and because of time, I was skipped this. Well, you can imagine all of us became homeless, hungry, and poor. Everybody had to depend on somebody else. I was exceptional because we had an uncle's house outside of the city. He fed us, clothed us, and looked after us. But a lot of people didn't have anybody to depend on, so they slept in the city and without knowing what happened to the soil, the ground. So the other first one went. The people who went out to other cities and villages, even up to Tokyo, but those people had a very hard time because the rumor started, those people who were in Hiroshima, they had poison with them. So the social discrimination against the people who were in Hiroshima, that kind of thing. So then the Japan surrendered. Occupation forces came for 7 years. The total social change, social political structure changed, new set of values, hungry, homeless. You can just imagine. But what troubled many people was the occupation forces imposed rather strict censorship, confiscation of anything people have written, and 32,000 items altogether, they were taken and shipped back to the state. That's just one example. And another example is that they established something called Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. People were happy. Medical center is going to be built. We can be looked after. No, soon we found out. They came to study us. We became the object of the research. And so anyway, that was the kind. I was not a fully grown up adult to make a proper judgment and assessment. But today, in reflection, I must offer my deepest respect to the adult survivors who tried to feed us, meet the physical need, and try to deal with healing, massive healing required of everybody. And they were the selfless people who were determined to rebuild their lives and family lives and community. And I pay tremendous respect, and this is the appropriate way to do that. Now, someday we can talk more in detail about the kind of oppression the occupation forces imposed on us. But in spite of that, people resisted, and they said, look, this is the beginning of something horrible. They could see by judging all the things we experience and so this is the beginning, and the United States was preparing for nuclear war. And that we cannot afford to allow. What we experience should never be experienced by another human beings. That became the basic guiding principle of our life. And so with that idea, and Hibakushi's have been talking about our personal experiences as testimony, as a warning. Sometimes people say, oh, you don't deserve pity. Well, you deserved it. You started it. You know, forever you started it, you know, that kind. But we are convinced it is our moral responsibility to share what we saw, what we experienced. And we have been doing in many different ways. Well, I happened to study in the States, and on the first week I arrived, and I started receiving hate letters because I made a critical remark of the Americans continuing testing of the hydrogen bomb in the Pacific at the Marshall Islands. I was critical about that. They thought, anyway, they tell me, I just arrived, but they told me to go back to Japan, and we don't need you, and who is giving the scholarship, you know that. So I was traumatized, and but somehow I did the soul searching. Am I going to pretend I didn't know anything about nuclear weapon? I can't go home. How will I survive in this country? It was the loneliest time, but I managed to come out of that trauma. Since then, I have been, I'm determined to share my experience and the thoughts based on that. And I found American people I met down in the States at the university quite different and justifying everything United States did to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was a good thing. Those were the good bombs which ended the war quickly. Those bombs didn't really end the war, really. It was the Soviet Union's intervention in Manchuria which ended the war. That's the consensus of the historian today. But anyway, I started at the grassroots level. I started talking in schools. And the fact that I worked with Toronto Board of Education for 20 years, that was a good place to find myself in and to examine the educational system of Canada, which was totally inadequate. I bet it's still very, and to teach the children to live in the nuclear age. They were not teaching anything. Well, that I cannot. But the thing which made me extremely happy during many years of my work is coming in contact with a group called ICAN, International Campaign to Prevent and to abolish nuclear weapons. And there I met a bunch of course, multi-generational, white-haired people were there, middle-aged people were there, but major leadership were coming from the younger generation, in 30s and 40s and so on. And I was so delighted. They were so well-informed and so articulate, so creative, and so energetic, and technically very capable. They were always using the computer or some kind of gadget. So the moment they decide something, in a few minutes, this information was shared with the young people or the people around the world. And of course, humanitarian approach became the very influential way of looking at nuclear weapon and how to think and how to talk about nuclear weapon, not the national security, human security, and put the people right in front of the discussion and concern. And I think that did a lot too. But it's the people and the leadership coming from that group, which was mostly, well, large proportion of that group were younger than me. I am in the 80s about that. So anyway, that group, actually, I offered something to that campaign, but that program offered me a lot. I got a lot. I think that helped me to deal with my own as a hibakusha and difficulties. So anyway, we did have some success. We achieved the treaty. And this is the point I wanted to say. I got the sudden notice, and then this morning I participated in the ratification ceremony offered by the UN. We have known the figure of 40 so far, but the 3 additional nations ratified treaty for the prohibition of nuclear war. And they are Ireland and Nigeria and
New
yeah. I was honored to be invited to the ceremony this morning, and I was congratulate them. I had a little remark to them. This is the biggest the information I wanted to share with you too. But you know, the first people I shared it with, whenever something special moment I experience, first people I want to share such happy news is those who perished, hundreds of thousands of perished people, victim people. We made a vow to them that we would work hard to ensure that their death were not in vain. And I was fortunate enough to repeat that again this morning at this ceremony. I did the same on July the 7th, 2017 at the United Nations when the 122 nations voted to adopt that treaty. There is somewhere deep inside my heart that they are always with me. And memories and images of those people have been the driving force for me. When I have problem, when I'm ready to give up, I hear some voice, I can't give up. So, you know, and this I had a project this summer to write an individual letter to all the heads of the state. And since this is the 75th anniversary, they asked me to write it in my name. And I have been getting some responses from heads of the state. And someday maybe I can share the content of that with you. I was delighted. I heard from the foreign minister and defense minister of Ireland this morning. Such wonderful, empowering letter, and I want to share that with you. Now, one more thing, sorry, I may be taking time, but one more thing. Recently, my colleague, historian, completed the work on Canada's part in the Manhattan Project. And after reading that report, well, there was impressive amount of evidence. Indeed, Canada was deeply involved with the UK and the United States. And children have been growing up with that part of the history. The most of the Canadians don't know. most of the adults don't know about that. And I thought that should be made public. And the fact the government hasn't acknowledged that. So I asked for the acknowledgement and the statement of regret, not apology, regret. And also asked the Canadian government ratify the treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. We are still waiting for that. Anyway, I have taken your time.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So,
I just shared the thoughts which came to my mind.
And we're very happy, Setsuko, that you did. It must be unbelievably painful to have to recount your personal experiences, and we know that you have done it many times for different people around the world. But I can tell you, having heard your experiences and others having heard your experiences is what has motivated many of us to become involved with the nuclear disarmament movement. I know that Beatrice Fihn this morning paid special tribute to the Hibakusha and the role that you played in building momentum and in building the resolve among diplomats and politicians around the world to get the job done, to get the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons negotiated and put in place. And we're delighted that you've shared the news that 3 more states have ratified. That makes 43. And we know it'll enter into force and become legally binding on those states that have become party to it. But it will then become part of international law. And hopefully that will happen within the next year. And even for those states that are not party, it has tremendous normative effect. It further stigmatizes nuclear weapons as though they needed further stigmatization around the world. But it will have great impact, both directly and indirectly. So we thank you so much for being with us today and for relating your thoughts, and congratulations on the letter that you have sent to the Prime Minister, asking him to acknowledge the role that Canada played in the Manhattan Project. We know that Canada provided uranium and helped refine uranium from the Belgian Congo that were used in those atom bombs. At least 10 Canadian scientists were directly involved in the project, and there was an agreement between the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom to work on this project together. So Canada is directly implicated, and this is something I think that many Canadians do not know. So thank you, Setsuko, very, very much. Our next speaker is a man well known in Canada and indeed to many around the world. The Honourable Douglas Roche, among many other things, is a former journalist, author of 21 books and countless articles, professor, member of Parliament, senator, ambassador for disarmament, founding chair of the Middle Powers Initiative and of the CNANW, and an officer of the Order of Canada. He has and continues to be a tireless advocate for nuclear disarmament, a friend and mentor to so many of us in the peace community, and something Doug himself might be most proud of. In 2010, he was made an honorary citizen of the city of Hiroshima for his work in nuclear disarmament. The Honourable Douglas Roche. Doug, please.
Thank you, and good afternoon to all. 10 years ago, on the 65th anniversary of Hiroshima bombing, I stood on a stage in Hiroshima with Kijo Matsumisha, also a survivor of the atomic horror as Setsuko. He told the audience about his experience of the attack when he was 16 years old. He said that he looked up from his classroom desk and there was an orange and yellow flash followed by a huge explosion and intense heat wave. I jumped under my desk. There was blood all over me. He said, "I'm going to die." Had he been on the other side of the room, where the ceiling collapsed on the students, he would have. But he crawled outside, found a friend with skin peeling away, and took him to the Red Cross hospital. When Matsushima finished speaking, I said to the audience, "He is my brother, for I too was 16 when the bomb exploded. He has suffered enormously. Now I must help to ensure that this never happens again." My bond with Hiroshima and Nagasaki started when I was a young parliamentarian and visited Hiroshima for the first time. I saw in the museums photos of whole blocks completely obliterated, the charred clothing and the depiction of survivors, their burnt skin hanging from the arms and heads. What made the horror even more unbearable was a large globe in the center of the museum showing all the places nuclear weapons are stored, ready to inflict the same damage all over again. That brings us to today. And as we heard a moment ago, 13,400 nuclear weapons possessed by 9 states, and all of them constantly modernizing their arsenals. We must not allow these instruments of blatant evil to go on mocking the Hibakusha. We must not allow politicians to go on pretending that we can escape catastrophic humanitarian consequences from the use of even one nuclear weapon. We must not allow Canada to go on ignoring its responsibilities to work to change NATO's outmoded nuclear policies and sign the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Nuclear weapons are immoral and illegal. The abolition of nuclear weapons is not just a lofty goal, a noble aspiration, an idealistic thought. It is the irreducible essential for survival. It is the paramount human rights issue of our time, and we must never stop saying this. The nuclear planners, fortified by the military and industrial complex, constantly rebuff us. But we would be false to the 75th anniversary of Hiroshima if we allowed this rebuff to diminish our efforts. The nuclear planners want to blur public opinion into accepting the inevitability of the strategy of nuclear deterrence. But we would be false to the Hibakusha if we did not expose the fallacy of this military doctrine. The nuclear planners want to smother our consciences, but we would be false to the long arc of justice if we did not keep proclaiming that the abolition of nuclear weapons is the prerequisite to peace in the 21st century. Finally, we who are working in this field must have confidence in ourselves because we are on the right side of history. Every day of the coronavirus pandemic, we're living through a new reality. Namely, we must implement common security for everyone. I endorse the new Canadian call to action on nuclear disarmament, sponsored by the Canadian Network to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. It's a dynamic appeal to the conscience of humanity to ban the instruments that would destroy all life on the planet. The Hibakusha have never given up their call for abolition, and neither should we. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Doug. And Thank you so much for endorsing the CNANW sponsored call to action on nuclear disarmament by the Government of Canada. This is a document that was sent to the Prime Minister and relevant ministers last week, copied to all members of Parliament and senators, to the diplomatic corps in Canada, and to many others in the peace community. It essentially asserts that Canada is well placed to play a leadership role in nuclear disarmament, as we have in the past, actually, ironically, in the early 1980s, under the leadership of then Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau. It also specifies actions, specific actions that Canada can take, working in cooperation with the United Nations, like-minded states, and civil society around the world to advance nuclear abolition. So I would refer you to that document. It is on the CNANW website. And if anyone has difficulty finding it, please just contact us and we'll make sure that you get it. Thank you. Thanks again, Doug. Our next speaker is Mr. Alain Dondenet, the head of mission to Canada of the International Committee of the Red Cross since 2018. Mr. Dondenet has also served with the ICRC in the Balkans, Uganda, Liberia, and the Russian Federation. Prior to his current assignment, he was with the Development and Cooperation Agency of the Swiss Federal Department of Foreign Affairs for 5 years, overseeing risk management. But his connection to Canada precedes this as well. From 2010 to 2013, he was the Canadian Red Cross representative to Sri Lanka and the Maldives. He has also worked with a Canadian NGO in the Philippines and with the First Nations Financial Management Board in Vancouver. Alain, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, dear, thank you so much, and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak today and to share the International Committee of the Red Cross and the Red Cross and Red Crescent Movement perspective on nuclear weapons. This week marks 75 years since the world witnessed the devastating consequences of the atomic bombs dropped on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. On the morning of August 6th, the first bomb exploded over Hiroshima. Within seconds, the city center and most inhabitants were decimated by a dome of deadly fire. A subsequent supersonic blast wave devastated an area of over 11 square kilometers. Just 3 days later, the second bomb destroyed the southern port city of Nagasaki. The Japanese Red Cross, along with the International Committee of the Red Cross and other humanitarian actors, did their best to respond to the horrors that befell the Japanese people in the aftermath of these attacks. They assisted the thousands of sick and dying victims after their cities had been razed. They did what they could when what remained of the local medical services and personnel were overwhelmed, and they helped long after the war ended. Despite this assistance, the two bombs were estimated to have caused an initial 170,000 deaths. That number doubled within 5 years as a result of radiation exposure and other factors. Since 1945, survivors and their descendants have continued to suffer health challenges, including extensive cell damage caused by ionizing radiation. The Japanese Red Cross has cared for thousands of these survivors, and we know now that the health implications of nuclear weapons last decades and span generations. We have come to understand that the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons are catastrophic due to all of these compounding impacts, starting with immediate death and destruction, followed by the blast and irradiation. We know the scale and level of destruction wrought on Japanese civilians at that time and in the decades since. And we also know that bombs dropped on Japan were tiny compared to those that are currently held in arsenals around the world today. Nuclear weapons today threaten the global environment and all of humanity. Any use of nuclear weapons in the future could result in hundreds of thousands of deaths and the suffering of hundreds of thousands more. Long-term threat to future generations would follow, as well as continued and increasing risks to the environment, climate, and food production. As part of the world's biggest humanitarian movement, The Red Cross and Red Crescent also knows we are simply not equipped to respond adequately to a nuclear weapons attack. In fact, there are no governments or international organizations that have the capacity to respond to the large-scale catastrophe that would arise. Yet, and it's been said, the possibility that nuclear weapons may be used again is increasing and is alarmingly high. States are scaling up their efforts to develop nuclear weapons that are more powerful, more precise, and faster than ever before. This disturbing trend is moving us away from nuclear disarmament towards the increased use of these weapons in the national security policies of countries around the world. Today, there are close to 14,000 nuclear weapons in existence, many of which can be launched at a moment's notice, and all of which are far more powerful than the bombs dropped in Japan 75 years ago. Under international humanitarian law, weapons that are by nature indiscriminate or cause superfluous or unnecessary suffering can never be used. In addition, any civilian death or loss must be proportionate to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated. With the knowledge of the effect of nuclear weapons on civilians, let alone the environment and global food production, it is hard to imagine what military advantage could weigh against the loss of hundreds of thousands of civilian lives. The Red Cross and Red Crescent movement states clearly that it is difficult to see how any use of nuclear weapons could be compatible with the rules of international humanitarian law. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, adopted in 2017, considers that any use of nuclear weapons would be contrary to the rules of international law applicable in armed conflict, and in particular, the principles and rules of international humanitarian law. Along with other international conventions that came before, including the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, and Nuclear Weapons Free Zone Agreements, the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons Treaty is an essential step towards a world without nuclear weapons. All states must come together and agree that nuclear weapons have no place in our future. The International Committee of the Red Cross and the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement are pressing governments around the world to recognize that any use of nuclear weapons would have a catastrophic humanitarian consequences, and encouraging states to sign and ratify this treaty in order to ban nuclear weapons forever. We must recognize the lessons learned in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945. We must learn from the hundreds of thousands of victims who suffered in the more than 7 decades since these terrifying weapons were first used. We must heed the words of humanitarians who have since 1945 consistently pleaded to never let this happen again. What we cannot prepare for, we must prevent. It is an humanitarian imperative to make sure that nuclear weapons are never used again. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alain, and thank you for the wonderful work that the ICRC has done and continues to do in so many places around the world. The most horrific situations take place. The Red Cross is there when others are pulling away. You guys move in and do a wonderful job. Our next speaker, Ms. Peggy Mason, like Mr. Roche, is a former Canadian ambassador for disarmament, serving in that capacity from 1989 to 1995. During that time, she also served as a member of the United Nations Secretary General's Advisory Board on Disarmament Affairs. Ms. Mason is currently the president of the Rideau Institute, an independent, not-for-profit think tank focusing on research and advocacy in foreign, defense, and national security policy. She is also very active with NGOs, including the Group of 78, the World Federalist Movement Canada, and is an advisor to the CNANW, which we very much appreciate. Peggy appears quite regularly before parliamentary committees, on the blogosphere, and in print media and radio and television. Like others here, Peggy is a force of nature in her own right and a tireless advocate for nuclear disarmament. Peggy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's really a privilege to be able to participate in this very solemn 75th anniversary event. When I was ambassador for disarmament, I and my colleagues from other nations traveled quite regularly to Japan because they often hosted UN-sponsored meetings to promote confidence building and other steps to lower tensions and create an environment conducive to arms control. Those visits often included a trip to Hiroshima and to the Peace Park at the epicenter of the nuclear bomb blast, and at least one occasion to Nagasaki to visit survivors. Well, on this 75th anniversary, we might have expected to have been well on the way to the total elimination of nuclear weapons, especially after the huge progress made in their elimination, in the elimination of large parts of the then Soviet and American arsenals at the end of the Cold War. And much more recently, after the 2017 negotiation and opening for signature of the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And of course, others have mentioned, but it bears mentioning again, 3 new ratifications today: Ireland, Nigeria, and Niue, bringing the total to 43 states parties out of the 50 that are needed for entry into force of the treaty. But despite clearly the wishes of the overwhelming majority of UN member states and their peoples, we are moving further and further away from nuclear abolition, as previous speakers have said. And as you yourself said, Earl, with all 9 nuclear armed states engaged to one degree or another in modernization programs, including an American program to the tune of $2 trillion. But as worrying as all that, even more worrying is the fact that the cardinal lesson of the Cold War, that a nuclear war can never be won and so must never be fought, that seems to be eroding, with both the American and Russian nuclear doctrines foreseeing new roles for nuclear weapons, with new roles for nuclear weapons and new types of nuclear weapons. And also, and this is very relevant to the role that Canada can play, Americans have developed a new tactical or battlefield nuclear weapon with a lower explosive yield and, relatively speaking, and more accuracy, giving the illusion of usability. And that term, illusion of usability, is a quote from the US Congress of the 1990s, which refused to authorize the development of those types of nuclear bombs because they felt they were so destabilizing. Now they have been developed by the United States. I want to talk a bit too about the call to action. The Canadian Network to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, in which the Rideau Institute is a very proud member, has issued, as has been mentioned, a call to action for the Government of Canada to reassert the leadership role we used to play. It wasn't just in the 80s, it was also in the 90s too. And when I was ambassador, Canada was seen as taking, for example, on the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, we were the lead co-sponsor of the resolution calling for that treaty before the negotiation of it, and well before the Americans would even consider discussing it, let alone negotiating it. And so this call to action wants Canada to reassert that leadership role. And very specifically in the call of action, it refers to something that really we need to keep mentioning it over and over. In the 2018 report on NATO of the Standing Committee on National Defense, there was a unanimous recommendation. That means that the Liberals, the Conservatives, and the NDP all agreed with this recommendation. And that was that Canada show a leadership role within NATO to effectively, they didn't use these words, to challenge NATO's nuclear doctrine and to challenge that body to start to live up to its commitment to begin to develop the conditions for a world without nuclear weapons. Certainly a first step in that regard would be for the 5 US nuclear basing countries, Germany, the Netherlands, Italy, Belgium, and Turkey, to refuse to accept these new upgraded tactical nuclear weapons to which I referred earlier. And certainly if it was up to the publics of those 5 countries, this incredibly destabilizing American proposal would be rejected. So just the fact that Canada would introduce this for discussion within NATO would make a huge difference, because the publics of the countries affected in Europe would be energized to respond as well. Because this call, of course, the call to action is also for ordinary Canadians. It's not just to our government to take a leadership role. It's for all Canadians to let the government know they support this leadership role for Canada. And before closing, there's one further aspect to the call to action that I would like to highlight. And this is the call upon Canada to adopt and to promote a new paradigm of national security based upon the principle of sustainable common security for all states and all peoples. And Setsuko called it human security, and that's in fact exactly what it is. The pandemic has raised the question worldwide as to why we are spending so much money on weapons and military responses when they are manifestly useless in the face of the existential threats of climate change, the destruction of nature, pandemics. The American presidential candidate Joe Biden has announced a true $2 trillion plan for a green transition of the American economy. That could be fully funded by ditching their nuclear weapons modernization program. Similarly, in Canada, we are going to need significant funds to propel the greening of our economy. The new defense budget that was announced in 2017 included a 70% increase in defense spending over 10 years, much of that to kick in 2021 for yet more new military equipment, including new fighter jets. Yet, the Department of Defense cannot spend the money already allocated to it, leaving about $2 billion unspent in 2018 alone. Why not spend all that additional funding on staving off the twin existential threats of climate change and the destruction of nature? And the third, of course, existential threat is nuclear Armageddon. The only answer, in my view, is a new security paradigm that recognizes we can only achieve true security when the goal, and this is really the vision of the UN Charter, is the common security of all states and their peoples, not holding the globe hostage through the threat of nuclear annihilation. We at the Rideau Institute have called this a shift to sustainable peace and common security. And I now, in closing, call on all Canadians to support the CNANW call to action by conveying their support by phone, by letter, by email to the Prime Minister or a local MP. And the Rideau Institute website, in our latest blog, which is on the call, we also have an email that you can send. You can use that email to let us know. And we are also compiling, a list of Canadians in support of the call of action. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you, Peggy, very, very much. Hear, hear. And, thank you for mentioning the all-party recommendation in the Standing Committee on National Defense in 2018 that recommended that Canada play a leadership role in NATO with respect to nuclear disarmament. Also recall in 2010, a motion that was passed unanimously in the House of Commons and the Senate calling upon Canada to launch a major international initiative to promote nuclear disarmament around the world. And we all recall who was in power at the time. I mean, I think that was a remarkable motion. And and we have seen Canada, and I want to go on the record as saying that we applaud the efforts of Canadian officials in various fora and processes, and we see them in action all the time, doing their absolute level best within the limitations of the instructions that they have received. We are directing our call to the political level to please give new instructions to your officials, to cut them loose, to allow them to play a stronger leadership role internationally. Give them the mandate. It must egress from the political level in Canada. And this starts with the Prime Minister. Sir, we implore you. Our next speaker Ms. Ray Atchison is the Director of Reaching Critical Will, the Disarmament Program of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. The WILPF was founded in 1915 to challenge militarism, patriarchy, and capitalism as the root causes of war. Ray continues this work today by bringing an intersectional feminist approach to disarmament and anti-war work at the United Nations and elsewhere. Ray represents the WILPF on the steering committee of ICANN, and also works on the campaign to abolish autonomous weapons, that is, killer robots, to bring an end to the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, and challenging the international arms trade and war profiteering. Ray, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thanks for organizing this commemoration and inviting me to participate in it today with all of you. It's always such an honor to speak alongside Setsuko at anything, so thank you for that. We're meeting today online in the midst of a global pandemic to mark 75 years of another pandemic, that of nuclear weapons. For 75 years, we've lived under the threat of radioactive blast and firestorm that Setsuko described, the effects of which are immediately devastating and punishingly intergenerational. For 75 years, nuclear weapon activities have contaminated the land and the water, disproportionately harming indigenous communities. For 75 years, corporations like Lockheed Martin and Boeing have reaped incredible profits from government contracts for bombs and for bombers. Last year, the nuclear armed states spent $73 billion on nuclear weapons. That's more than $138,000 per minute. This is why in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis, the United States actually has more nuclear warheads than it has hospitals. While people of the world have suffered from these economic choices, others, of course, have profited. Certain academics and politicians and bureaucrats have risen through the ranks of think tanks or governments in positions that are bankrolled by these nuclear profiteers. And they spin theories of nuclear deterrence and strategic stability to justify this massive, unconscionable investment in technologies of violence. This is nuclearism. Nuclearism is the mythology that nuclear weapons are essential for security, that nuclear weapons somehow deter conflict. But it's an epic feat of gaslighting. It insists that weapons that can kill everybody on the planet many times over are the only things keeping us safe. Nuclearism is patriarchy. It's the dominance of a mindset that says violence equals power. It's a mentality that comes from the domination of men over women, of white supremacy and wealth, of able-bodiedness and heteronormativity. It's part of the capitalist prioritization of profit over people and part of the militarism that accumulates wealth through war. It's also one of the many structures of violence that plague our societies today. The policies of nuclear weapon development, testing, and use are policies of radioactive racism. The same racist ideology that enables certain governments to explode nuclear bombs, dig up radioactive materials, and bury nuclear waste on indigenous lands and near poor communities also lies within our carceral systems and our border controls. As we work for nuclear abolition, we need to pay attention to patterns of oppression and violence. We can see these in other structures of violence that we face. For example, right now, much of the technology, tactics, and the levels of brutality that we're seeing right now from police in the streets of US cities were tested at Standing Rock against indigenous water protectors. The Border Patrol agents who were recently let loose on the streets of Portland fine-tuned their tactics and their dehumanization on migrants and immigrants. Some people say that Canada is different, that these types of things can't ever happen here, that we don't have the same history of racism or the same history of violence. But none of this is true. Our history of violence and oppression is marked across the land and water of this country, marked by who lives where, what languages are spoken, how we treat our environment, our reliance on extraction to generate wealth, what we're taught is possible, and who is called naive. We need to understand our history, our real history, not just what we're taught through heritage moments. The history of uranium mining on Indigenous land in Canada contributed to the bombs dropped on Japan and facilitated the nuclear arms race and the spread of dangerous nuclear power around the world. Today, this is mirrored in Canada's investments in another toxic industry of oil. Canadian corporations, with the support of the government, build pipelines on Indigenous lands and commit acts of violence against protesters. We saw the Canadian settler states' violence against the Wet'suwet'en. We saw Jagmeet Singh get thrown out of parliament while trying to bring a bill against racism. We saw activists recently getting arrested for defacing statues of racist figures in Toronto. We need to look at how our government responds to protest and uprising. We need to pay attention to what weapons and technologies of surveillance it's investing in. And Peggy just spoke about the investments in militarism that are going up. But this is not just about preparing for the worst. We have the chance to do what people in many other countries don't have, which is to build the world we want rather than to respond to some sort of dystopian nightmare while it's unfolding. Right now, there are calls across Canadian cities to defund the police, abolish prisons, and build alternative structures for preventing harm and for transformative justice. This incredible work is crucial to building the type of communities in which we can all live and thrive. This work is about, among many other things, disarming and demilitarizing. It's about divesting from weapons and violence and investing instead in peace and equality. Abolishing nuclear weapons is part of this work. Canada doesn't possess these weapons, but our government says that outlawing them is useless. It's said that it wants nuclear disarmament, but then it supports the possession and even the possible use of nuclear weapons by its allies as a member of NATO. The government says it wants to develop a feminist foreign policy, but it refuses to join the only existing treaty that categorically prohibits these patriarchal weapons, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. In response to Setsuko's appeal to Canada to join the treaty, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and then again today, spokesperson Adam Austin, they just say that they salute the tireless efforts of activists to draw attention to the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. This isn't enough. This recognition of the catastrophic harms caused by these weapons must be followed by real action to abolish them. It's time to shake off the nonsense that we have been force-fed about strategic stability and deterrence, and learn from those who have actually experienced the realities of nuclear weapons. If the Canadian government is serious about being feminist, about healing its relationship with Indigenous nations, and about being a leader against climate change, it has a lot of work to do. Something it can do right now is to sign the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and start the process to ratify it. Outlawing nuclear weapons for all countries and setting the stage for the elimination of these weapons, the treaty also recognizes the disproportionate impacts that nuclear weapon activities have had on Indigenous communities. It recognizes the gendered impacts of radiation, and it calls for gender diversity in discussions on nuclear weapons. It includes provisions on victim assistance and environmental remediation, recognizing the harms that have been caused and the needs of communities that have suffered. Canada's joining this treaty would be a significant, meaningful step toward actually fulfilling the role of peacemaker and being a leader in reconciliation that it claims to be. For activists across all the work that we need to undertake for a more peaceful, equitable world, it's imperative that we deconstruct power and center lived reality and create a political economy of non-violence. Regardless of what political or social project we're working on, these are key ingredients to fostering change, and nuclear weapons are no exception. We can abolish structures of violence. This is not naive. This is not out of reach. Just a few hours ago in New York, the state attorney general gave an order for the dissolution of the National Rifle Association, one of the most powerful institutions in the United States. Change is possible. We can stand up for peace. We can stand up for justice. if we persevere through struggle and find hope in our collective efforts. Thank you again very much for inviting me to participate in this commemoration and to say with all of you, never again.
Thank you so much, Ray. As you were speaking, I recall the Socratic dictum, the unexamined life is not worth living. And that applies to nations as well as individuals. We must examine our own national life and actions. I wish we had time for that discussion because you've given us, Ray, so much to talk about and to think about. One area I would like to challenge you on, very briefly, or just make a comment in fairness to the comments made by the Prime Minister in the House of Commons. I don't think he described, I think he said that nuclear disarmament was useless, but he was referring at that point to the negotiation of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and he qualified that by saying, in as much as no nuclear armed states are participating, that he thought it was useless, which in itself is, to me, a not an appropriate thing to say. I mean, how can you simply dismiss the actions and the wishes, the heartfelt determination of 122 countries around the world that did come together when thousands and millions of civil society representatives around the world in full support. So although it was inappropriate, I think it wasn't accurate. Sorry, we could continue, but we will move on. Thank you so much, Ray. Our next speaker is Mr. Cesar Jaramillo, who is Executive Director of Project Plowshares, a division of the Canadian Council of Churches. Cesar's area of expertise and very effective advocacy include nuclear disarmament, outer space security, and conventional weapons control. As an international civil society representative, Cesar has addressed the UN General Assembly First Committee, the UN Conference on Disarmament, the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, and states parties to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, the NPT. He has also been a guest lecturer in many academic institutions in Canada, China, India, among others. And Cesar is also a member of the 6-person steering committee of the Canadian Network to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. And we're very lucky to have him to help guide our work. Thank you. Cesar, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Earl, and thank you everybody else who's joining us today on this very solemn occasion. First of all, of course, I want to offer my respects to Setsuko, and through Setsuko to all Hibakusha, and as we remember the suffering that befell them 75 years ago. And of course, my appreciation to all my fellow panelists, for each of whom I have the deepest respect for their expertise. But I mean, the case I want to make today is that you don't need to be an expert to be all for abolition. You don't need to be a nuclear disarmament expert. You don't need to have attended conferences at the United Nations or even understand the difference between uranium or plutonium or anything like that. There is no need, because the case, for all the intricacies and the high stakes nature of the negotiations, the case is ultimately very straightforward. We have this threat, this existential threat that could eliminate humanity as we know it, the ecosystem, destroy it completely. And this threat is human-made. And this is an eminently solvable threat, because if just like it was human-made, it is also in the hands of humans to eliminate them and find a solution. However, what is the problem? You know, if you ask what is the problem, if the case is so straightforward, why do we still have around 14,000 nuclear weapons? And the answer is equally straightforward. There is a sector in the world that does not want disarmament, period. You know, they'll speak about, you know, this is not the right treaty or the right forum and ideal international security conditions and modernization and new threats and old threats and the Cold War and the Cold War 2.0 and anything you want. But at the end of the day, there is no need to overcomplicate it. And if you cut through the noise, there is a sector in the world that does not want nuclear disarmament, period. So they need to be pushed. They need to be pushed hard. They need to be pushed in a way that reflects the gravity of the threat and the urgency of a solution. That's how hard they need to be pushed. Because the alternative, to wait for these states that rely on the purported benefits of nuclear weapons to start and complete an elimination process on their own accord, is a pie-in-the-sky scenario. That is not happening. And this assessment, rather gloomy, admittedly gloomy, is not based on opinion or interpretation. This is not a matter of bad faith about the future behavior of these states. This is a case of historical record. This is a case of knowing for a fact that the NPT, 50 years later, half a century later, has not delivered on the promise of abolition. That is not speculative. We know that. Not only has it not delivered, these states are not in a neutral position, like they're not fully on board with abolition efforts. They are a known obstacle to these very efforts. They oppose them. They make the threat worse year after year. You heard the reference to the doomsday clock earlier today of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist. Closer than ever to this metaphorical midnight and catastrophic event. Closer than ever, closer than 53 when it was at 2.5 minutes. So the threat is not speculative, the threat is not made up, that we know, but neither is speculative the resistance to abolition. The obstinate, stubborn resistance to abolition, it is well known. It is reflected in their actions, their policies, and their doctrines. It is the sort of white is black, night is day contradiction when they say that they support the pursuit of a world free of nuclear weapons. Don't be fooled by that. That is every single state's declaratory policy, that they dream eventually of a world without nuclear weapons. And even if that eventuality were so, there's a sector in the international community now, including civil society and a growing number of progressive states, that doesn't think that we can wait, that we can afford to wait to that eventual ideal international security conditions, that we need to complete abolition now, promptly, as soon as possible, on the premise that it is possible, that it is not pie in the sky, that with political will, there is every reason to believe that it is an achievable global objective, that it is not beyond our collective ability to address this threat. And bear in mind the irony that the 5 nuclear weapon states under the NPT, because there's 4 others that I will speak about, that the 5 under the NPT are the same 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, which is incidentally tasked primarily with the maintenance of international peace and security. So, of course, the irony is not lost that these spoilers are the main obstacles to getting rid of this existential threat are the ones tasked with our collective peace and security. So the contradiction there is not lost either. And then comes in the ban treaty. You know, this revolutionary idea born out of frustration, born out of the knowledge, the recognition, the undeniable reality that the earlier approach was not working. That not only was it not getting us closer to abolition, that we were drifting farther away from it. So something needed to happen. And what happened was the very welcome Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which I support, with Project Plowshares wholeheartedly supports, as a path forward, because the earlier model was not working. It was getting us worse and worse and worse. And so we were not discouraged or put off by the opposition to this effort, because it is entirely predictable. If nuclear abolition is ever to be a reality, it will always face stiff opposition. You know, there is no other scenario. There is no smooth sailing to nuclear abolition. So we're not put off, we're not surprised, we're not discouraged. Of course, they're gonna try to fight it. We're attacking these deeply entrenched, dangerous doctrines that are holding humanity hostage. So yes, it is all within the territory. They are going to push back. Don't let that scare you off, folks. Of course they will push back. We need to push harder. We need to put their feet to the fire. We need to hold them accountable. We need to make linkages to IHL, to international humanitarian law, to key principle of distinction, the proportionality, precaution. we need to link to the new legal lever provided by the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. We need to point to declaratory policy about supporting a rules-based international order, about feminism, things that need to mean something, and that could be materialized through joining the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. But in this whole regime, in this whole conversation about abolition, there is a very problematic misconception that I want to address. And there is this misconception that there are essentially two camps in the nuclear abolition conversation. The small minority that have nuclear weapons, you know, the stubborn ones, and the vast majority of the international community that is in unison, sort of calling for abolition and pushing for the prompt measures towards nuclear disarmament. The reality, however, is that there is a third group that is almost as problematic as that small group of nuclear weapons possessors. And it is the nuclear dependent states, where Canada sits firmly in this group. These nuclear reliant states that have been allowed for too long to traverse these two worlds, to have this double personality. On the one hand, they present themselves as responsible international actors and on the world stage at NPT conferences. We could have had nuclear weapons, but we forwent them. You know, there's moral righteousness. At the same time, they are actively and continually supporting the nuclear deterrence doctrine of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Openly, they participate in the nuclear planning group. They think it's okay for US bombs to be stationed in the Netherlands, in Italy, in Turkey, in Germany. They refuse to acknowledge any language and in the United Nations forums that refers to the unacceptability of nuclear weapons use under any circumstances. They will not go there. They always leave that possibility open that nuclear weapons may serve a purpose. And so they must also be pushed. We must push not only the ones who have them, but the ones that are standing in the way of the progress of a growing number of states in the international community. So what is their response? What do they say to us when we push them, when we corner them? You know, various things. First, premature, if you can believe it. To say that today, 75 years after the obliteration of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it is premature, according to them, to talk about the prompt and complete elimination of nuclear weapons. And it's not only 75 years after Hiroshima, it's half a century after the entry into force of the NPT, which promised abolition itself. It's more than 30 years after the end of the Cold War. So this notion that it is somehow premature defies credibility and common sense. They also say that conditions are not ripe for nuclear disarmament, that there are no ideal conditions, as if to imply that there is some ethereal future, you know, in some dimension where there will indeed be ideal international security conditions for nuclear disarmament. That is a fallacy. For one thing, the rest of the international community, the vast majority that have lived up to their end of the NPT bargain and have not proliferated, do not make their proliferation commitments contingent upon the emergence of some Kantian ideal international security conditions. They comply, rain or shine, because that's the way the law works. So this argument that we must wait for ideal security conditions, it's a delay tactic that we cannot allow ourselves to be fooled by. They also say that the nuclear ban treaty, this treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, undermines the NPT, when that is not the case. When the NPT has not only not delivered on the promise of disarmament, but there is no likelihood that it will in the near future. This is not to say that the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty does not hold value. It has held remarkably well as a framework to address the issues of proliferation and the issues of the uses of nuclear energy. But the disarmament pillar has left a lot to be desired. It has not worked, and therefore the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons constitutes a complementary measure that fills that void. But they are right on a couple of arguments that they have made against with regard to the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. They say that it is divisive, and divisive it is, very much so, by design. It is intended to be divisive, of course. They criticize it for a lack of consensus, cleverly, when it is they who prevent consensus, full consensus from emerging. But of course it is divisive, because we don't want to have two categories of states with in the world with regard to nuclear weapons, those with and those without. We want everybody, of course, to be in the camp of non-nuclear weapon states. And they also say that a legal prohibition is no substitute for actual weapons reductions. Of course it isn't. It is what sets the framework for those reductions. Canada has invested heavily, for instance, in disentangling the FMCT file, you know, money, per diems, resources, etc. That doesn't translate into concrete reductions. It hasn't, but that doesn't make it any less worthwhile. These are all welcome initiatives, and they hold value because they help us craft and strengthen the norm against the possession of nuclear weapons. But at the end of the day, this is a humanitarian and political struggle of the highest order. You know, the states with nuclear weapons have dug in their heels. They have spoken, as Peggy said, of usable, or at least weapons that create the illusion of usability. They have spoken of having the biggest and the better still recently. Trump is president, Kim Jong-un is president, Vladimir Putin is president. So it is not fear-mongering or speculation. The risk level is real, the risk level is high, but it is also not speculation to say that the answer is well known. You know, we know what we need to do. And the fact that nuclear abolition has not happened yet is not evidence that the case is flawed. It is simply evidence that they are not listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Cesar. I can only agree with everything that you say, and I'm sure we all ask ourselves, what will it take to make them listen? What will it take to have nuclear armed states and umbrella states actually take matters in hand, though they're all, of course, say that they're in support of nuclear disarmament, while acting in a manner that would make it appear that the opposite is true? Will it take another nuclear event? And if one happens, will it be a single event, or will things spiral out of control and it could lead literally to the end of the world? I mean, this is not science fiction. This could become fact before we know it. So, as you say, we have to press governments to act before it's too late to act. Our last speaker, last but not least, is Dr. Michel Duguay, whose PhD, by the way, is in nuclear physics. For many years, Dr. Duguay worked with AT&T and Bell Laboratories in areas including optoelectronics and laser physics, over the years publishing more than 75 articles and obtaining 30 patents. In 1988, he joined Laval University in Quebec, where he focused on optical communications, solar energy, and a new conceptual approach to space-time and special relativity, the so-called diachronic approach that offers an original solution to the twin paradox of special relativity and in quantum optics, of which I'm sure, I certainly am not familiar. I'm not sure how many are, but very, very interesting areas of expertise. In 2005, Michel since 2005, rather, he has been very active in the Let's Move Quebec Out of Nuclear movement. And since 2014, he has been heavily involved with the movement to improve international security and to promote nuclear disarmament. He's taken a novel approach, in my view, demonstrating how the life sciences, especially genetics and genomics, can illustrate the fundamental similarities among people and all races and promote unity for all of humanity. Michel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Earl. Can everybody hear me fine? Yeah? Okay. So this presentation will be in English, but I will say a few words in French at the end because Earl asked me yesterday. I want to address the question of motivation. What can be done to motivate us, promoters of nuclear disarmament, and our friends? With this in mind, I propose a new idea, which is deep time self-identity in nuclear disarmament. I'm sure that every once in a while you think about yourself. What am I? The age-old philosophical question. What am I? Qui suis-je? And there's an answer that's being given by the modern science of genomics and genetics. Since 1989, there's a new entity going on in science, which is called the Human Genome Project. When you talk to people in genetics, genomics, they have this understanding that there is such a thing as the human genome, and basically each one of us is a facet of this human genome. So from a scientific point of view, there's many ways of seeing that we are all from the same genetic family, so that dropping bombs in a foreign country is fratricidal. If you drop bombs on Moscow, you're going to kill your own genome, which is here and in Argentina, everywhere around the world. So I'll follow my text so I don't go over time too much. So if you were to include your genome in your self-identity, the benefit you will get from that right away is that your lifeline will extend to 500,000 years ago if you identify with Homo sapiens. If you identify as being with life in general, then you extend your lifeline to 3 billion years, to the time when the first cells were evolving in the sea. So think about this, that your identity is much larger in the eyes of modern science than what was taught us. When I was about 7 years old, I went to church on Ash Sunday. They put ashes on my forehead and they said, well, remember that you are nothing but ashes and you'll go back to being ashes. Well, that's not true, because you could take a few cells of mine, keep them at liquid nitrogen temperature for a while, and in theory, I could be cloned. The first man who had his entire DNA sequenced was James Watson, the discoverer of the double helix for the structure of DNA. I am sure that he has in mind, oh, well, you never know, in 100 years from now, science might decide to clone me, bring back to life this little boy whose name will be maybe different from James Watson, but who biologically will be the same as James Watson. There's a big project to bring the mammoth back to life, and this will probably be done. Sorry, I went off on a tangent. So I need to explain this figure here. We cannot see it very well on the camera, but it is already on the Science for Peace website. Richard Sandbrook was very much interested in my article, asked me to condense it. So if you go on the Science for Peace website, just put in Dugouet in the search engine, right away you'll fall on the article, and you'll see a really nice picture of yourself. This is yourself. This is a man, but here's the woman. From a genetic point of view, this is you. You should be able to see your genes. Modern society will save a lot of lives if we can fight the RNA, which is like DNA in the virus. So it's coming along. Let's hope that by the end of September, we'll have a vaccine. Anyway, the drawing is explained on the Science for Peace website, and rapidly it goes like this. I had the artist put your own genome here over the face. At shoulder level, the genomes of your parents, mother and father. At the waist level, the genomes of your grandparents, 4 of them. And the legs are filled with the genomes, symbolically, of your 8 grandparents. It so happens, why did I have this idea? Well, it turns out that when I was 12 years old, we had a French teacher who was very much interested in life, the life sciences, and we were trying to figure out how a molecule like DNA could reproduce. Of course, we had no idea. But perhaps because of these scientific discussions, it came to me in my own thinking about myself that I am very much an amalgame, as we say in French, a combination of my 4 grandparents, 2 of whom I knew, and 2 of whom, Mary MacDonald, of Scottish descent, and Robert de Guay, whom I never met because they died well before I was born. So it was very strong in me that I was made up of those 4 people from a genetic point of view. And so now I'm extending it here to essentially, like many other authors have done, all the way back to the beginning of Homo sapiens in the form we know, which is about 500,000 years ago, possibly 1 million years ago. Anyway, you'll get more of the details on the website. So I'm going to come to the second point I wanted to make. So the second point is that these genetic scientists have written many books, about 20 of them, excellent books. And one of them has established that 1400 years BC, we all had the same ancestors. So never bring up the argument with me like Bob Kennedy did once with his wife, telling her, "You're not a Kennedy." You know, well, I'm partly a MacDonald. Actually, when you go back in time enough, you are partly everybody who ever lived, going back to 1400 years ago. So I'll conclude. The biggest problem, and I agree with many speakers, the biggest problem, you very well know, is the military-industrial complex. Now, Tom Sauer, whom many of you know, professor in Belgium, has made the point that even though those people want nuclear weapons, you know, the big lobby, when you study them, as he does, you find out that what's most of interest to them is money. I point out to you that I worked for 3 years in a nuclear weapons laboratory, Sandia Labs in Albuquerque, New Mexico. There were many topics of conversation, and none of the topics of conversation touched upon nuclear war. We were discussing lasers and missiles and all kinds of stuff, but there was a huge taboo talking about nuclear war. Nobody I ever met in the defense complex, and I worked for 25 years in the military industrial complex. Bell Labs, where I was, had a division of military applications. Nobody I ever met wanted to have nuclear war. But at Bell Labs, where I was, we did discuss the possibility of nuclear war. And of course, everybody was against it. But when you have to make the choice between money at the end of the month and your strategic weapons choice, sometimes the winning wins over. So I want to come to a conclusion. Thank you, Earl, for allowing me a little time. Alors, en français, plusieurs scientifiques et auteurs ont déclaré que le 21e siècle, 21st century, sera le siècle des sciences de la vie. We live in the 21st century. That's going to be the century for the life sciences. From the point of view, du point de vue de notre intelligence rationnelle, les arsenaux nucléaires n'ont pas de sens puisqu'ils pourraient nous tuer, qu'on habite à Washington ou qu'on habite à Moscou. Modern genomics, la génomique moderne nous a fait découvrir des frères et des sœurs. Modern genomics tells you that you have brothers and sisters in Moscow and elsewhere. Alors, la génomique moderne nous induit à faire partie de cette grande famille et à coopérer avec eux, to cooperate with them, on all the big problems we have, sur tous les grands problèmes planétaires. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Michel. Thank you for pulling us back from the immediate issue and looking at things from the perspective of our species, not just our nations or even as individuals. We too often forget that there is far more that binds us than separates us. It's been said many times because it's true. Ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to almost to the end of our program. I want to thank each of our distinguished articulate speakers. I am profoundly sorry that we do not have a fully bilingual capacity and couldn't and weren't able in time to make arrangements for translation. We will hope to do so next time. I would like to thank all of you who attended our event today, and my colleagues in the CNANW Steering Committee for helping to organize today's event. And although you can't see her, our program coordinator, Sarah, who has kept things running smoothly this afternoon. I'm going to end now by ringing a bell of sorts, 75 times to mark each year since the horror of the nuclear bombing. We do this in memory of and to pay tribute to those who died as a result of the bombing 75 years ago. May there never be another victim of nuclear weapons. We wish this for our children and for succeeding generations. Thank you. I will now ring this bell 75 times. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us this afternoon. Goodbye. Be safe. Thank you.